Today I'm going to be learning about Sweden and Swedish history in particular, and this is World War II from the Swedish perspective. And yeah, I thought this would be interesting to watch because I don't really know too much about Sweden during World War II. Being British, when I went to school and did history, we learn about World War II mostly from like a British perspective, so we don't really hear about what happened in other countries. So I'm really intrigued and excited to find out. You can tell me what you know. I'm sure there's going to be a lot of people with a lot more knowledge about that than me, so it'd be great to hear your knowledge and what you know about it. But yeah, interested to learn. This should be enlightening and fun to learn, so let's watch.
In 1939, war swept across Europe. As conflict advanced toward its borders, Sweden managed to maintain its neutrality. Situated in the frigid north, the country was no stranger to harsh winters. Yet, with its neighbors falling under occupation and external pressure mounting, the Swedes were compelled to consider if their accustomed resilience to the cold could parallel their ability to withstand the storms of war. Though it had once been a great power in Europe, Sweden had long been absent from the chessboard of European conflict. The traumatic loss of Finland to the Russians and the cession of Sweden's final mainland possessions following the Napoleonic Wars pushed Sweden to pursue a policy of neutrality. Aided by its strategic position in Northern Europe and lack of entanglement in European military alliances, Sweden was able to successfully remain neutral throughout the First World War, though its government favored the Central Powers. Despite suffering some economic hardship and political strife, Sweden avoided the post-war devastation of many other European states, and public consensus strongly backed continued neutrality in future conflicts. However, as the 1930s came to an end and the clouds of war once more gathered above Europe, Sweden's resolve would be put to the test. Before we continue, I'd like to thank the sponsor of today's video, Polscairn, the world's leader in watches, jewelry, by clicking our link in the description below or by scanning the QR code on screen. On September 1st, 1939, Germany began its invasion of Poland. Despite its immediate declaration of neutrality, Sweden had already indirectly contributed to the war. From the panzers dashing across the border to the fighter bombers strafing Polish refugees, it's estimated that almost 60% of the iron used to build these deadly machines came from Swedish mines.
Oh, that's interesting in itself. Is that still something that Sweden produces? Did that bring a lot of wealth to the country at the time? And yeah, what do you think about just that neutrality at the time?
Recognizing the importance of Sweden's iron supply to the Nazi war machine, really? Both Britain and Germany rushed to negotiate with the Swedes, who assured the British that they wouldn't increase iron exports to Germany above their pre-war level. However, by slyly including the now occupied territories of Czechoslovakia and Poland within their definition of German pre-war imports, Sweden was able to simultaneously satisfy the German desire for increased iron deliveries. Following the fall of Poland, Sweden was faced with a threat much closer to home as the Soviet Union began its invasion of Finland. As Sweden and Finland enjoyed close cultural and historic ties, the Soviet invasion led to widespread outrage amongst the Swedish public. Additionally, Stockholm was well aware that a Soviet victory in Finland would place the Red Army at Sweden's doorstep. Therefore, deviating slightly from its traditional neutrality, Sweden declared itself a non-belligerent in the unfolding Winter War, which allowed Sweden to transfer considerable quantities of weapons to the Finns while avoiding war with the Soviet Union.
Well, that's an interesting move as well. Yeah, so that is what he was talking about there. I would love to know more about what Swedish people were thinking at that time, seeing their neighbour potentially be invaded. I know that there was a war or battle there with like the Winter War in Finland. Tell me if you know of anything like that. But it's really interesting to know like Sweden really held some power there with those iron exports, and yeah, changing the definition there to be non-belligerent just so they can supply arms to Finland was like quite a good move as well, I guess.
Drawing from its limited stockpiles, Sweden provided Finland with 84,000 rifles, 112 artillery pieces, and 25 aircraft. Additionally, over 8,000 Swedish volunteers successfully fought alongside the outnumbered Finnish army.
Yeah, that's one thing, I don't really know. I've learned about the Winter War before and Finland's resilience and ability in those conditions fighting against the Russians, the Soviets. But I don't think I really knew about this. So yeah, great respect to these Swedish soldiers as well.
Though Swedish aid helped prevent Finland's complete collapse, the tiny Nordic nation was still forced to yield to Soviet territorial demands in a Swedish-brokered peace deal. In the chaos of the Winter War, Britain saw an opportunity to disrupt Sweden's continued iron exports to Germany. Under the guise of aiding Finland, Britain offered to land thousands of troops in Norway before transporting them over Swedish railway to the front lines of Finland. Once within Sweden, however, these British troops would be directed to seize iron mines and other critical infrastructure, shutting down Swedish trade with Germany. But to Britain's displeasure, both Sweden and Norway saw through this ruse and denied British permission to carry out this would-be double cross.
I think that's fair enough. Like, it's like really shows that Sweden is sticking to its principles and being neutral and being non-belligerent. Is like neither side can get what they're going to do what's best by Sweden. Like very strong mentality and leadership.
Nevertheless, war would come to Scandinavia all the same. On April 9th, 1940, less than a month after the conclusion of the Winter War, Germany launched simultaneous invasions of Denmark and Norway, Sweden's two western neighbors. While Denmark was immediately overrun, Norway fought on long enough for an Allied expeditionary force to arrive, though this too was soon defeated by the Germans. Despite the battles raging across the border, Sweden itself was not invaded, as Germany felt no need to risk its current stable Swedish iron supply. Regardless, Swedish diplomats and politicians were deeply intimidated by Germany's show of force. With both of its neutral neighbors suffering unprovoked invasions, it was becoming increasingly clear that the fate of Sweden's neutrality might be decided not in Stockholm, but in Berlin. For all their outrage at Germany's invasions, there would be no Swedish intervention. Swedish politicians were divided on how to respond to the conflict unfolding all around them, but were ultimately fearful of German retribution. While many in Sweden's government advocated for continued neutrality, a notable voice in favor of intervention was Sweden's Crown Prince, Gustav Adolf, who argued that Sweden's moral duty to defend against injustice should take precedence over its desire for peace. In the end, the voices of neutrality proved louder.
Yeah, I guess why do you think that was? Especially a prince, you would think that they would have and especially at these times have maybe more power, but I guess it must have just been maybe a democratic vote or something like that. They did it democratically. So interesting to see there was a mixture of opinions at that time, which you would expect, I think, but interesting to see how they actually proceeded from there.
Similarly to the political situation, the Swedish military response to the German invasion of Denmark and Norway was mixed. Sweden had long assumed that the Soviet Union posed the greatest threat to Swedish independence and had given relatively little attention to German aggression. Though fortifications had been constructed along the southern coastline, Sweden failed to mobilize its military before the German assault, meaning that their borders were initially only lightly defended. Within less than a month, however, Sweden had called up an additional 230,000 men to defend the southern coast and the long frontier with Norway. With the effectiveness of Germany's war machine displayed right before its eyes, Sweden quickly realized that its own military forces were inadequate. Sweden's conscript-based army was highly motivated and well-suited for local defense, but lacked any significant amount of heavy equipment. The Swedish Air Force was additionally in poor shape, with only 180 outdated aircraft compared to more than 4,000 commanded by the German Luftwaffe. Attempts to purchase additional equipment were complicated by Sweden's neutral status, as most nations were unwilling to sell valuable weapon systems when their own forces desperately needed replenishment. Luckily, Sweden was eventually able to leverage their industrial know-how to begin the production of their own military equipment, a practice which continues to this day. Slowly, resources poured into national rearmament, but it would still take years for Sweden's anticipated resistance against Germany to be measured in months rather than weeks. On the economic front, Sweden also found itself on the back foot, with a vengeful Finland joining Hitler's war against the Soviet Union to reclaim lost territory. Sweden became completely surrounded by the Axis. Making matters worse, a German blockade cut Sweden off from its western trade routes and confined its economic activity to the Baltic. Though Sweden had stockpiled resources, it was forced to rely on trade with Axis-aligned nations for many of its most important goods. Eventually, Sweden was able to negotiate safe passage through the Atlantic for several ships a month, allowing for the import of vital resources from the West. However, this lifeline would be continually threatened by both Britain and Germany. With their relative vulnerability early in the war,
it's like, yeah, just interesting as well that being neutral, not only it doesn't just like let you be, it means everybody goes against you rather than just one side or the other. So being neutral in a way has good points and bad points. Again, like, what do you think about that? Again, people with more knowledge would probably be able to articulate a better opinion on what's better. You can tell me in the comments.
With their relative vulnerability early in the war, Sweden felt forced to acquiesce to a series of unsavory German demands. Immediately following the fall of Norway, Germany successfully pressured Sweden into allowing the passage of off-duty German soldiers through Sweden on their way to occupation duty in Norway. A year later, in June of 1941, Sweden was faced with a much more serious crisis, when Germany demanded that Sweden allow 14,000 heavily armed Wehrmacht troops to pass through Sweden on their way to participate in the invasion of the Soviet Union. This demand flagrantly violated Sweden's neutrality and set off a minor political crisis in the country. Eventually, it was decided to grant the German troops passage, but it was made clear that this would be a one-time exception. In July, when Germany again requested to send armed troops through the country, Sweden refused. Nevertheless, in the opening months of Operation Barbarossa, Sweden allowed 75,000 tons of goods to be transported to Finland to facilitate their participation in the war against the Soviet Union. On the return trip through Sweden, these trains evacuated wounded German personnel. The Swedish public's attitude toward Germany during the Second World War was complex. On one hand, many argued that Sweden had gone too far in its accommodation of German demands. But, on the other hand, cultural and political ties between Sweden and Nazi Germany remained quite strong. Openly fascist sympathies were quite rare in Sweden, though some 200 Swedes did serve in the Waffen-SS. However, most Swedes did not equate affinity for Germany with Nazism, and there was some sense of normalcy between the two countries. But as Sweden was soon to find out, there was nothing normal about Germany's plans for Europe. Like most of the world, Swedish officials had reacted with relative indifference to Germany's initial persecution of Jews. Following Germany's early annexations, immigration laws were tightened to prevent Jewish refugees from fleeing to Sweden, and there would even be some demonstrations against the import of Jews. However, when Germany began implementing its final solution in Norway, Sweden dramatically changed its approach to the unfolding Holocaust. Hundreds of Norwegian Jews were allowed to cross the Swedish border, and Swedish citizens expressed their disgust at Germany's genocidal policies. When Germany attempted to eliminate the Jewish population of nearby Denmark, Sweden declared that it would grant asylum to all Danish Jews who reached its shores, leading to a massive rescue effort that saved around 7,000 people, the vast majority of Denmark's Jewish community. Later in the war, Swedish diplomatic protection was extended to Jewish civilians all across Europe, with Swedish diplomats such as Raoul Wallenberg involved in aiding thousands more Jews from other European nations.
Yeah, that one I never knew. So that's actually quite amazing to hear that. I wonder how many Swedish people know about this sort of thing. What do you learn about World War II actually in school, or whenever you do learn about it? Is it things like this? Like, again, like, it was a very complex war, and like, again, being neutral seems to have added like a lot of complexity to it. Yeah. And again, like that, I guess that would be reflected in the populace of Sweden as well, just having a lot of different people having different opinions.
Sweden also became involved in militarily supporting its neighbors to a limited extent. Beginning in 1943, Sweden began arming and training thousands of Danish and Norwegian soldiers. Officially, these troops were advertised as police forces, but in reality, they were designed to move into Denmark and Norway at the end of the war, securing the countries until their respective governments could return from exile. In contrast to its proactive support of its occupied neighbors, Sweden insisted on its right to trade with Germany, even as it became clear that the tides of the conflict were shifting. With only intermittent access to the West, Sweden had come to rely on German-supplied coal to heat its homes and power its factories. In exchange for this coal, Sweden exported ores such as iron and mechanical components such as ball bearings. Ball bearings in particular were crucial for the production of military vehicles, aircraft, and other machinery, highlighting the strategic importance of Sweden's industrial exports to the German war machine. The Allies did not necessarily object to the concept of Swedish trade with Germany, as it was understood that Sweden had little choice. But the Allies were furious that Sweden chose to pay for its goods with militarily vital supplies. At one point, American representatives informally threatened to bomb Swedish factories if they did not reduce exports to Germany. Gradually, however, under increasing pressure from the Western Allies, Sweden rolled back its trade with Germany until it almost completely ceased by the end of 1944. As 1945 dawned in Europe, the eventual collapse of the Third Reich seemed all but inevitable. No longer fearing a German invasion, Sweden began to favor the Allied powers far more overtly. Almost 200,000 refugees from Sweden's war-torn neighbors were accepted into the country. Allied planes were relatively unharried if they strayed into Swedish airspace, and Sweden even began talks with the Allies about participating in the liberation of Denmark, although this ultimately proved unnecessary. By the time Hitler's empire fell in May of 1945, Sweden had seemingly chosen a side. Nevertheless, the legacy of Sweden's participation in the Second World War continues to haunt the country. With the benefit of hindsight, many question if Sweden was too quick to accommodate Germany, or if it could have done more to help the Allies. Most importantly, many have begun to wonder if neutrality could truly be justified in a conflict that was waged not just against states, but against humanity itself.
Yeah, interesting documentary. So very eye-opening. Yeah, I had no idea about a lot of that. Even just Sweden's position being neutral. But yeah, it's like, as I said, a very complex time. Like looking back, you can analyze it, but in that moment, it's obviously very difficult to make decisions. But yeah, interested to know like what people think about it today. If people even still think about it, what's your opinions on Sweden's position and what went on? How do you learn about this sort of thing at school? What sort of point of view do you learn about World War II or any other conflicts that Sweden has been involved in or not been involved in, I guess you could say, about this one. But yeah, tell me what you think about this one. Thanks.